Meena Nampa is the housing manager at Chino Community Services, which is a non-profit organization based in Richmond. It provides services to vulnerable and low-income people, and people marginalized due to race, ethnicity, immigration status, and poverty. Meena has been instrumental in linking low-income clients with good legal advice, newcomers with settlement services program, and providing temporary housing for the homeless. She has been a strong advocate for affordable housing. She received the Woman of Distinction Award last year, which is in 2018.
So looking forward, I think we have some great presenters. So the topic that we're going to be talking about is poverty, social justice, and inclusion. My favorite. So we have four presenters: Ishmam, Sonali, Rajdeep, and Avanti. Ishmam is a UBC student and the president of Kitchen on Mission, a non-profit that supports the weekly diets and hygiene and leads over 1,100 homeless individuals in Vancouver. He's a leader of Marco Student for Modular Housing and a community organizer with Vancouver Tenant Union. In 2018, he was awarded the Mayor's Achievement Award for Youth Excellence in Affordable Housing Champion by BC Nonprofit Housing.
Hi, I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that we're on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And my presentation today is on anti-poverty activism in Vancouver and how we can replace charity and equality as concepts in the models that we employ to hopefully create change. And so I want to begin by talking a little bit about charity and equality. They're words that have distinct and positive connotations. They're preached as mechanisms by which we help other people, and at first blush, participating in charity seems like a positive thing to do, or at the very least, it's harmless. But when we begin to scrutinize the ways in which charity and equality, or rather equality and treatment, are practiced, at least on a local scale, we begin to see more and more that all signs point to a new model of activism that instead champions justice and equity. In this talk, I hope to dispel the existing reverence we all seem to have for charity, altruism, and individual action, and redefine how we can effectively reshape how we view forces like the government, activist groups, and nonprofits, to be more considerate of what the people who are at the losing end of injustice really need. The points that I draw upon examples of local issues that were either improperly dealt with in the past or are currently being poorly managed. But I'd like to preface my presentation by saying a few things about where my interest in this topic comes from. About a year and a half ago, the City of Vancouver announced a housing project in Marpole, where I live. And the project saw a lot of pushback from community members who claimed that they had some sort of claim over who got to move into their neighborhoods. And they argued that somehow low-income people moving into a suburban neighborhood was dangerous to children and elders in the neighborhood. And so what we did was we tried to push back against that misguided narrative with a campaign to make sure people who needed housing would eventually get it. And we were successful through the help of several other community groups that reached out, and we were successful in making sure that 78 people were housed eventually. And through an organization I run called Kitchen on a Mission, we've supported Marpole's modular homes and 13 other supportive housing projects in the city with weekly hygiene and food products to make sure that we supplement the amount of food that they get and that they have proper access to several different types of hygiene products. But that's charity, and I'm going to pick apart what Kitchen on a Mission is about and how we've restructured the model that we employ to make sure that people have food and hygiene products, and how we're moving from charity towards justice. But I want to start off by saying a few things about where I think the limits of my voice are, and what I think the most important part of activism is, and that the most important lesson that I've gleaned from the time I've been doing this work, which is very short, is that it's often most powerful to center activism on people who are most affected by it. That it's important to sometimes take a step back and let other people lead the charge. And it's most effective if your activism includes being of use to organizers who are centered in justice. And that's an idea that I'll bring up throughout my talk today. In the talk itself, I'd like to briefly talk about 3 different ideas. The first is charity and the normalization of injustice. The second is reframing the role of government. And finally, I'm going to apply the new model of activism that we've built into the final part, which is analyzing when and in which situations consultation and public participation should be applied. And we'll look at supportive housing as a case study to talk about when we should be listening to neighborhoods and when the right that people have to housing outweighs that. But let's begin with talking about the problems with charity. This is one of my favorite pieces of art. It's a Banksy piece, and it pretty much, it's pretty self-explanatory and pretty catchy. But I want to be very clear about what my stance on charity is. I don't think that we should abandon charity right away. I think that we should instead focus our attention on reducing the grapple hold that it seems to have on our activism. And that we need to start making injustices in our society more conspicuous. And that we need to see charity fundamentally as a failure on elected bodies and as communities. Because real systemic change comes when the need for charity doesn't exist. And that's something that we have to begin to realize. Efficient Darren Asamaglou outlines one such drawback of altruism and charity in the Boston Review when he writes, "In the case of philanthropy and charity, the problem isn't street justice, but replacing the government's role in, say, providing health care. This dissent uncovers the most scathing hole in how we view charity, that its practice makes space for the entrenchment of the social dynamics that perpetuate the need for charity. Without the very existence of charity, regardless of effectiveness, the onus of addressing injustice would fall directly and intensely on the government and all of us who are in charge of keeping that body in check. For example, if charities like Kitchen on a Mission that distribute food to food insecure individuals in Vancouver cease to exist, the pressures to solve food insecurity would be far more intense on the government. While charities can be effective in keeping communities going on a short-term basis, long-term relying on third parties and their activism in the long term is just not sustainable. Our efforts need to be shifting towards justice. It should not be the role of students, nonprofits, and activists to close the seams in our food systems, for example. It should be their role to fight for food systems devoid of seams entirely. The solution to food insecurity, for example, on a local scale is not charity, it's the eventual abolition of charity. And my view is that we can only achieve equitable food systems when we don't have charities like Kitchen on a Mission at all. But how do we get there? How do we abolish this reverence that we seem to have for charity? I think it posits a shift in how we interpret its very existence. Instead of viewing it as this inevitable benevolent force, I think we should see it as a failure, again, on all of us in the public sector. But drawing from personal example, admittedly, it's difficult to connect your awareness of your complicity in the problems of charity to proactive steps towards dismantling charity's hold on activism. Kitchen on a Mission is charity. What we do on a daily basis and on a weekly basis is charity. But what we've done is we've moved towards a more justice-based system of activism. We spend more time now fighting for actual food system solutions in our food systems, for housing solutions, and solutions to other things that disproportionately affect low-income people. And one of my favorite parts of what we do is that our mantra is that our goal is to go out of commission. We want to stop working, because when we get there, when we uphold our justice-based activism, when we get to a point where Kitchen on a Mission ceases to exist, we'll have actual food solutions in our food system. And one of the projects that we've taken on this year that addresses all of this is we're currently in the process of publishing a book that's set to publish in about 2 months that takes the voices of the tenants of Marple's modular homes and students in the neighborhood and gives them a platform to really talk about these issues because those voices, specifically the tenants of Marple's modular homes, were overshadowed by the people in the neighborhood and the misguided narratives that were going around. Which leads to the next idea that I want to introduce, which is the importance of using equity to reframe the role of government. I organize with and volunteer for the Vancouver Tenants Union, an organization that builds grassroots support for progressive policies that protect tenants in Vancouver. And one of the policies that I organized in support of this year was a ban on renovations, essentially taking the stance that landlords should not be able to evict tenants for renovations without the tenant having the option to come back after the renovations are complete. Renovations are a form of systematic eviction that's a huge source of stress for working and low-income people in our city specifically. And some of the arguments that were being used to shut down renovictions in City Hall were deeply troubling and problematic, but one of them was specifically pertinent to this discussion and misguided. Several city councilors argued that a ban on renovictions would benefit the lives of working people, sure, but at the risk and at the expense of wealthier landlords, and that it was council's job to, I quote, not tip the balance too much. The irony in that statement is the problem with striving for equality in treatment. It's an endorsement of the status quo, which is deeply flawed and unequal. Effective activism employs equity instead. It recognizes the fact that real social change requires that some people often have to take steps back. And that this leads to the next modification that I think we need to have in how we view government in the public sector. Instead of viewing it as this force that is supposed to help everybody, instead of viewing government or public officials as people who hold office to fight for everybody, we need to reframe that into holding public officials responsible only for fighting for the most vulnerable, only fighting for the least fortunate. Finally, I want to tie all of this back to the topic I opened with today, which is supportive housing. Sorry, I'm a bit thirsty. Let me grab some water. This is Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. It's a commonly cited model that defines levels of participation in policy decisions. It classifies different types of public engagement in decision-making in terms of policy into non-participation, tokenism, and citizen power. Essentially, the idea is that ideally we would get to citizen power in all forms of public decision-making. But in the paper itself, in more depth, I argue that there are limits and exceptions to this model that this model doesn't do a very good job explaining. What it overlooks is that, and what much of the discourse about supportive housing in our province overlooks, I think, is that the idea of consultation has to be fundamentally different in different contexts. Consultation as a process needs to be different when we're talking about supportive housing versus when we're talking about projects that gentrify low-income neighborhoods. In an article published in late 2017, Darcy Bennett of Pivot Legal Society writes, municipalities across BC have authority to hold public consultations and approve or dismiss applications to develop housing using their power over land use and zoning within their jurisdictions. This power, which is well equipped to consider traffic flow, sewers, and view corridors, has resulted in a series of poorly managed referendums on whether or not people living in poverty belong in a community. I think the idea of citizen control, and Pivot argues this as well, is being co-opted by groups who discriminate based on social class. It's being used as a way to justify movements to keep people out of homes. We're seeing this play out right now in Maple Ridge, where people are chanting things like "our neighborhood, our voice." And we saw it play out in Marpole, we saw it play out in Richmond as well. So instead of embracing this democratic participation and consultation blindly, I think it's imperative that we apply an analysis of context, of power, of situation, when we decide when our basic model of citizen consultation applies. Pivot rightly argues that when it comes to gentrification in low-income neighborhoods, those people should have citizen control. And consent, not consultation, needs to be the level of public participation. But when it comes to the "our neighborhood, our voices" rhetoric coming from people trying to keep out low-income people in the neighborhoods, we need to learn from what justice and equity teach us, that we need to continue to fight for working people and people who need help, and we need to center them in that fight. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you.